This video is a quick overview of what you need to know and work on for Chapter 2 of the GAME Introduction to Programming class at El Centro College. I will be picking up some material from Chapter 2 of your book. It covers pages 11 through 31 and has an assignment that you can find in the appendix you will see later in eCampus. Not necessarily a link, but some information on where to get the assignment in your book. It will also be part of what's written at the bottom of this page. So to get started, we should have already installed, or rather gotten an account on repl.it. You should already have a username. It should already have access to the website. It may look something like this. At the top left, you'll see your username, and mine is idtprof for this video. You should see the blue button to the top right. That's how you will be creating a new file, a new REPL. And once we get started, this will change into an IDE, a development environment, and we'll be ready to get started. So I can't show you the pages because I'm sure of copyright problems, but you should have a copy of this book. I'm looking at page 11. Chapter 2 begins, and it's titled Create a Custom Calculator. It has the introduction to what's going to happen. If I flip the page and go to page 12, the first order of business is going to be printing. Elsewhere in this section, I will add links to particular sections of W3 schools that deal with the content at hand. For example, just now, the printing, I'm going to just paste this manually, but this is going to be the link that I'll be sharing with you. W3 schools talks about the print function. I'm not going to talk too much about it in this video since it's all explained in your book, and those first pages, it starts on page 12. And obviously you can always visit this link with W3 schools and get some information about print. Before I get started with talking about print and everything else that I need to cover as far as chapter 2 is related, that is printing, escape codes, comments, assignment operators, variables, and operators, you should be reading this content in the book. I'm just going to overview it, like I said, with you in this video. Before I get too involved in telling you or going back and forth with the chapter, I'm going to go back to repl.it, and I'm going to open up a new document so that I can show you what needs to happen or what you can do to try out some of the things, some of the operations that are outlined in your text. First of all, I'm already logged in. Like I said before, I'm going to create a new REPL. I'll click on that button and I get this this box. It's asking me what language do I want to use. You may see different things, but I have Python up at the very top. I'll click on it, telling it this is the language that I want to use. And I'm going to name this REPL something. It doesn't need to be something specific since this is not for an assignment. It's just for trying out and demonstration. You can always go back and change the code if you want. I can do the same. I'm just going to call it chapter 2. Notice how I'm using all lowercase and no spaces. It may not be needed for this particular website, but it's just good practice to never use uppercase and not to insert any spaces when you're naming something. I'm going to find this green button below and create my REPL. Once that happens, I get this screen. This is the IDE, the development environment. I have a couple of windows, or rather multiple windows, 3 windows. The one in the middle is where all the code is going to be typed. The one on the right is where the code will display, or rather print, what the operations are once the program runs. And at the left, we just have links to parts of the program. This is the main Python part of the program, and that's where I'm going to be typing things in. I'm going to change my settings just to make it a little bit more comfortable. In my room, the dark mode works a lot better, so I'm going to change it below here and just say, well, first of all, font size, make it large so I can read it, and the theme, I'm going to make it dark. And now it's a little bit more readable, at least to me, and I can hide this now by clicking the settings button again. Now I only have two windows, although the main.py still remains there. Okay, so now, as I said before, you should, I did already provide you with a video demonstrating print and a link to show you what the program would look like at the end. But just to try out things in chapter 2, and I hope that you have your book and you're reading along and trying out the things that it tells you to try out. Beginning with print, I'm going to just retype the same things that I typed before. Print just basically will display a message or a value to the screen. So if I use print, open up parentheses, and I open up quotes, notice how REPL is automatically closing the parentheses and the quotes as you open them. That way you can just type in what you need on the inside. I'll just repeat the same message as before, hello world, exclamation point. This is a string, therefore it's inside of these quotes. If it were a variable or a number, I wouldn't need the quotes. And then I'll run it just to check out and make sure that my system is running correctly. On the right now I see hello world, and I know that it's working fine. I can tell it to print hello world. The chapter tells you that you can also print numbers. For example, if I want to print the number 10, I could just say print 10. I could also print the result of adding the number 10 to another number. So I would say 10 plus 5 and expect to see 15 later. If I want to do other operations such as say my favorite number is inside of quotes, I could always concatenate. That is, I can just add a space inside the quote, click it plus to concatenate, and just put in what your favorite number may be. I'll just arbitrarily pick a number here, the number 12, and run. On the right, I'll see the results of my typing, and I see that I have a syntax error because I went a little bit too fast, too far. It's telling me that there's missing parentheses in print, and sure enough, I'm just telling it to print 10, like this was Python version 2, this is version 3. So I'll go back and just correct those errors. Python will try to help you out with errors on the right side when you see this red text and give you some idea of what's going on. Some may be easier to understand than others. For example, the first ones I was just missing parentheses, and I fixed that. So now I see hello world 10 and 15. The line 4 is giving me another error, and I will explain this a little bit more later, but it says that I can only concatenate a string and not an integer to a string. It just doesn't like to put together numbers that are integers and strings. So I can fix that by replacing that plus sign with a comma and running it. So now there's no concatenation. Instead, there is now hello world, print the number 10, print the result of 10 plus 5. My favorite number is 12. Notice that there's an extra space because I was wanting to concatenate, so I had tried to correct that by adding a space there. But if I delete it, the comma will then just add a single space. So everything that I'm telling it to do on the left side is displayed on the right side. And so now, yet again, I know that the system is working just fine. I have shown you now something that's on page 13 of your book, printing the results of expressions with specifically line 3, print 10 plus 5. I can delete everything else. I like Python and languages like it because I can go back and edit, and immediately the interpreter will run the code for me. I don't have to compile it. I don't have to wait for results for too long. If you move on to page 14, it tells you other things about escape codes. Escape codes are important to know. There's one in particular that you want to definitely remember, and that is if you do a / with an N, it will add a return. This comes in handy if you print long sentences, for example, the one that I have there as a sample. that I do believe it says something simple like this is my sample. If I wanted to just print that by running, it would say this is my sample. I'll get rid of that operation so I don't see it again. If I wanted to add returns, I couldn't just come in and say, well, this is my sample and expect to see it like this in multiple lines. If I run this, let's see what happens. I get an error because it's reading from left to right, and suddenly this is followed by nothing. Is just floating on its own, and then it just becomes a big mess. So what you can do is say that this is my sample, bring it back to one single line, and if we add the escape character, which I said before is the forward slash followed by an N, and then notice I'm replacing also the spaces with the character /N. This is my sample. I now would expect this to see in separate lines if I run it. And sure enough, on the right side, this is my sample. Although it's one line that goes from left to right for quite a ways, it does break after this is and my, thus giving me all of these lines. Read also on page 14 the other escape codes, and just remember that there are other escape codes for special characters. For example, if you wanted to print a quote that is constantly used in strings, you have to give it a special character. If you wanted to give it a special return carriage return rather, just go straight from one line to the next without any interruption. There is another one for that. Just know that there are other codes that you'll be able to use when the time comes. Something else that you need to know, and that's going to come in real handy, is how to add comments. On page 15, there's information. It's basically a hashtag, the pound sign, the number sign, whatever you want to call it, and it's followed by a comment. That is whatever your comment is on this code. I could say that this is my first program, and run it again, and it prints the same thing, and you'll notice that this comment or any comment like it will not be printed. It's just there so that the next time that I open up this document, I can see something that I know to myself or to the next programmer that I left behind. The next thing on page 16, we have assignment operators. And there's one in particular that you need to know more than all of them, and that's the equals, and that's the equal sign. Whenever we go and work with variables, it's going to come in very, very useful to use the equal sign to tell a variable that it's going to hold a value. For example, a character, or rather a variable, can be the letter X or a longer word, but I'll just use X for this example and say that X is equal to, and give it a value. X could be equal to 5, and then I could tell it to print, like we have before, print parentheses X, and run this. X is assigned the value 5 with the equal sign. That's the assignment operator. And now when we print X, we see that the result is 5. If I wanted to work with this, since X is equal to 5, I could say that let's print X plus X. So now it's 5 plus 5. Run it, and the result is 10. So it's working correctly. I could also tell it to, once it does that operation, let's say I'm going to change the number, or rather the value of X, to something else. I'll say it's X is 6. And then I'll tell it to print X times 2. So X is 5, and then it's going to print X plus X, so that should be 10. And then X is now equal to 6, and it should print X times 2, which is 6 times 2. I expect it to print the number 12. I click on run. I get the 10 for the first operation, and then I get a 12 for the second one. And that's pretty much what's on page 16, that your assignment operator just gives value to your variables. Let's say also that I want to have a string that is a series of letters as opposed to just a number, and I'm going to say that there's a variable, and it's going to be called name, and name is, I'll just say game, the name of this course, for example. Name is game, and print name. I'll run this, and now the equal sign has given the value of game to name. As we saw earlier in the video, if I wanted to print this with some numbers, with some integers, with some other variables that denote numbers, there might be some problems, and we'll correct those as we get to them. This is basically an introduction to what's going on page 18 when we talk about variables. They'll show you some samples with X and other variables. Be sure to read on page 19 what the legal variable names are. You want to have lowercase for the first character always. If you want to have first name, you would say something like first. And then maybe use camel case, that is with the hump in the middle, a capital N, first name, and then that would be your variable afterward, first name. Notice how in the IDE, once I start to type the letters FIR, which are start first name, it's wanting to finish that for me. So I'll just click on that and it finishes the typing on its own. On page 19, like I said, you'll see the legal variable names, and very importantly also the illegal variable names, so that if you're thinking about using a similar variable, you maybe change your mind. On page 19, there's also operators, and I've already used a few of them in this video. For example, x was equal to 5, and then I told you that if x, or let's use another one, let's say that y is equal to 5 plus x, let's make that a real plus x, then I expect y to get the value of 5 plus 5. Just to finish the operation, I'll say, hey, print y, and tell it to run. And the result is the number 10, since y is equal to 5 plus x, which, by the way, x was 5. So y is equal to 5 plus 5, and it prints 10. I'm moving along to page 20. This is more information about the order of operations, and this is more of a math thing. I forget what the mathematicians call it. I want to say that it sounds like pandas or PEMDAS. This is something that is much too new for an old-timer like me. I learned math a different way, but I know that the order of operations is important. Python will evaluate expressions using the same order of operations that are expected in your standard math expressions. For example, it's going to do the multiplication before it does addition. It's going to do division before it does subtraction. The sample on page 20 will give you more information. There's also a note about trigonometry functions, and then on page 21 there is a sample of a custom equation calculator. It's basically a word problem that tells you that a program can use Python to calculate the mileage of a car that drove 294 miles on 10.5 gallons of gas. So if you know that the car drove 294 miles and it used 10.5 gallons of gas, it's 294 divided by 10.5, 10.5 in this case. And I could, yes, the very simple way of doing this is just to print and give me the result of this operation. Print 294 divided by 10.5, and it'll give me an answer. But for that, I can use just a regular calculator. We're doing programming, so I can tell it to do a lot many other things. I can use this function over and over again, and what helps out is to use variables. So rather than just telling it to print the numbers as they are here, I can start to make some assignments, and I'm just going to delete everything except the numbers. And to show you that, then if let's say miles, we'll use the letter M is equal to 294, assign the value 294 to M. That's the number of miles. The number of gallons that were used, we'll say G is equal to 10.5. and then let's get a result from there. Let's print, rather than 294 divided by 10.5, let's print m divided by g. And I guess it's good practice to add some spaces to make your code a little bit more readable. But if you don't use any spaces at all, you'll still get the same results. 294 divided by 10.5 is 28, and I get the result on the right. The point that the book makes on page 21 is that since we just talked about good variable names, is that maybe instead of just saying miles, you want to say miles driven. And remember, no spaces. You can use the camel case, or you can use an underscore to separate miles driven. Gallons, we could say gallons used, gallons underscore used is equal to the same number. And now, rather than just printing this, why don't we generate a new variable, and it's going to be called miles per gallon. MPG for short is going to be equal to miles driven. And I forget that we can all just click miles driven divided by gallons used. And then rather than printing the formula, since we've already done the formula on line 3, we can say to print what the miles per gallon are. Print MPG. Let's run this. And once again, we get 28. We have a longer program, and it runs the same result. However, if you're using this for other purposes, if you want to change the miles driven, it's a lot easier to figure out that this is where those go. You could just come back and say, well, actually we drove 400 miles and only used 10.5. That's a really good car mileage. Let's run. And yes, we get 38 point, a long number after that. We can do Control Z to go back, that is to undo 294, and we'll get the same result as before, 28. So that's why we want to use longer names, legal names in our programming, so that when we're actually working with characters, we're working in the game, we have a lot more control about what's going on. After page 21, there is a space on your pages 22 and 23. There are some samples that maybe you can follow along. Don't get too confused by the shell, the Python shell. We're not using that program for this class. You can always download Python on your own and install it on your computer, and you would get a similar window to that. But since I can't guarantee that everybody has a PC or an OS 10 machine, a Macintosh, but I know that most people in this class have a Chromebook. That's why we're using repl.it. So whenever you see those boxes, the blue boxes with the shell, make sure that you're actually doing them on repl.it so that you can save them as well. Then on page 25, there is a review about everything on the chapter. There's a whole bunch of little questions and problems. Please review those and try to answer the questions as best as you can on your own. If you have any questions, please send me an email asking about it. And then at the very end, it says to check the appendix for the exercise that goes with the chapter. And that's going to be actually in your eCampus toward the bottom, where you'll see that you will have to do lab 2.2. It's page 348 in the book. You're going to do parts A, B, and C. In the next video, I'm going to walk you through part A. We'll create the first calculator. On your own, you'll have to create part B and part C. So I'll see you in the next video, and we'll get coding.